Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
"2023 was an active year at the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and it kicked off with a bang.
We all know change is inevitable.
The 4th annual North Carolina Transportation Summit welcomed more than 1,000 attendees who heard from industry leaders and policymakers on topics like equity and access in transportation, economic development, and hiring and competing for workforce after a pandemic.
NCDOT has significantly increased our capabilities to recruit qualified, diverse candidates to help our team advance smart transportation.
With hiring on the minds of many, NCDOT continued to hold disadvantaged business enterprise outreach events across the state. This year, more than 300 people met with DOT staff and learned how to compete for transportation contracts. Those contracts led to major impacts that North Carolina communities need, want, and will use. In 2023, NCDOT awarded about 550 contracts for about $3.2 billion in construction and maintenance projects. The department awarded a more than $240 million contract to upgrade US 70 to interstate standards. That stretch will be part of Interstate 42. Also, the Greensboro Urban Loop opened, completing the 49-mile loop around the city. 2 new lanes of Interstate 40 from southeast Raleigh to Clayton, Wilmington's Military Cutoff Road extension, and Harkers Island Bridge down east all opened to traffic in 2023. Harkers Island Bridge opened nearly a year ahead of schedule and is an example of the state continuing to be innovative. This project is the first in the state to use carbon fiber reinforced steel, making it more resilient to the coastal environment. The state's intercity passenger rail service, NC by Train, is also making history. In 2023, NC by Train saw its highest ridership ever for 1 month, carrying nearly 70,000 passengers. NC by Train added another daily round trip between Raleigh and Charlotte and continued special stops at the NC State Fair, Lexington Barbecue Festival, and Panthers games. NC by Train finished the year with a special guest.
One thing that people are recognizing time and again is that our passenger trains can get them from one place to the next in a very comfortable and efficient way.
When it comes to travel, the Connected Autonomous Shuttle Supporting Innovation Program, or CASI, continued its rounds, including a stay in Cary and then Charlotte. Making sure the public has the latest information remains to be a top priority for NCDOT. The Ferry Division developed a new notification system allowing passengers to receive a notification when ferry schedules are interrupted by weather or mechanical delays. The Division of Motor Vehicles also created a new feature on its location webpage to show the current wait time at driver license offices. The future is looking bright in North Carolina. The Federal Rail Administration awarded the department the largest grant it's ever received, a $1.1 billion grant for the first portion of the S-Line, which will connect Raleigh and Wake Forest. U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg came to Raleigh for the announcement.
For so many Americans, going to be a better way to get around, a safer way to get around, a cleaner way to get around, a more convenient way to get around. And we're going to be working with local and state governments and the railroads to bring these projects to life.
The bipartisan infrastructure law brings hundreds of millions of dollars in grant funding to our state. This is helping fund significant projects like replacing the Alligator River Bridge on US 64 between Terrell and Dare counties, constructing the Yakusta Trail between Brevard and Hendersonville, and improving bike, pedestrian, and public transit facilities in multiple municipalities. 2023 also brought some leadership changes in the department after former Secretary Eric Boyette retired. New Transportation Secretary Joey Hopkins has worked at the department for more than 30 years, most recently fulfilling duties as Chief Operating Officer.
I'm grateful for being part of the team that was able to accomplish these great things in 2023, and I'm so looking forward to what we can do and moving into the year 2024.
Chris Peoples is now serving as NCDOT's Chief Operating Officer, and the new Chief Engineer is Lamar Sylvester. He is the first African American to fill that role in the department's history. We look forward to 2024 and carrying out our mission of connecting people, products, and places safely and efficiently with customer focus, accountability, and environmental sensitivity to enhance the economy and vitality of North Carolina.
Please welcome NC Board of Transportation member Pat Malamphy.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. As a member of the NCDOT Board of Transportation, I'm acutely aware of the critical role transportation plays in our state's success. North Carolina is booming. We're seeing tremendous growth across our communities, from the mountains to the coast. This is fantastic news, but it also presents a challenge ensuring our transportation needs are met. Efficient and reliable transportation is the lifeblood of our economy. It connects business to markets, workers to jobs, families to essential services. It allows our goods to move freely, our students to reach their schools, our visitors to explore our state. At NCDOT, we're committed to building a transportation system that supports this growth. We're investing in infrastructure projects, improving safety of our roads, and exploring innovative solutions to meet the ever-changing needs of our state. However, we can't do it alone. Collaboration is the key. Today's event brings together a diverse group of stakeholders, policymakers, engineers, industry leaders, and community members. By working together, we can ensure North Carolina transportation system remains a driver of progress and prosperity for all. I'd like to introduce our session moderator, Chris Peoples. Chris is a key figure securing the future of transportation in North Carolina. Chris will lead our discussion today on navigating the trifecta, P3, politics, policies, and public sentiment. Please give Chris a warm welcome.
Thank you, Pat. Good morning, everybody. Like every state in, in the nation, North Carolina has experienced a dramatic increase in infrastructure costs. Also, like many other states, the transportation needs in North Carolina far outweigh available funding. This is a problem that could only get worse as the country shifts more towards electrification and more fuel-efficient vehicles. Our panel will discuss one option for potentially delivering crucial infrastructure on an accelerated schedule. As more people move to North Carolina every day, NCDOT and many transportation planning organizations across the state started exploring the role of public-private partnerships, also known as P3s, and what that role could play in tackling the gap between needs and resources. P3s are typically long-term 20 to 50-year contracts with strict performance requirements set by the public owner that often include private equity and long-term debt obligations on the part of the private sector partner. They can leverage the private sector's expertise to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain public infrastructure. Currently, North Carolina has one operational P3. The 26-mile express lane project stretches from uptown Charlotte to Huntersville and opened to traffic in 2019. The partnership had challenges along the way and certainly provided many lessons learned for all involved. The fact remains that drivers traveling the corridor now have the choice of reliable travel time, and even drivers that do not elect to use the express lanes are experiencing improved conditions and travel times. We also realize that a P3 allowed this project to be delivered years before traditional funding would allow. We owe it to every resident of our state to explore all tools at our disposal that will provide safe and efficient travel options throughout North Carolina. Planning organizations and local leaders benefit from knowing what options they have when when making transportation decisions for the communities they represent. Additionally, federal regulations now require the evaluation of P3s for projects that cost more than $750 million. In our discussion today, you will hear from transportation leaders and policy experts who are paving the way for innovative project delivery and providing real results in the lives of people across the country. My goal for you is to walk away with more information about the historic challenges we face and the important role P3s could play in our state's future. To help with that, I'm joined today by Helen Pinkston Pope, Commercial Advisory Administrator, Georgia Department of Transportation, Dr. Sean Wilson, Senior, Vice President at WSP and former Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development Commissioner. Dr. Jonathan Gifford, Director, Center for Transportation Public-Private Partnership Policy at George Mason University. And last but not least, Mike McDermott, Head of Portfolio Management at Build America Bureau. Thank you all for joining us today. So shortly, each panelist is going to come up and give you a brief presentation on their background, their experience with P3s, and some context around that expertise and perspective. Once you've gotten to know the panelists a little bit, we will get into a discussion amongst the panel and all of you in the audience. If you have any questions through today's discussion, there'll be a time when we'll ask for our, audience questions, so please prepare yourself for that and be ready when we call you out. Please welcome our first panelist to the podium, Dr. Sean Wilson.
Thank you, Craig. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on P3s. I'm going to give you a quick overview in my 10-minute window of what happens in Louisiana and kind of some lessons learned, both in terms of the policy implications for project delivery, as well as the benefits. The first thing I'll tell you, if I can make that clicker click, is my background is in urban and regional planning. I am not an engineer. I spent several years in the Department of Transportation as Chief of Staff and then Secretary. But more importantly, I've lived in Louisiana for my entire life. And there are projects that we talked about, and I'm going to highlight this one today, the Belle Chase Bridge and Tunnel project. It was about 5 miles away from my house, and it talked about being replaced for decades. The first thing I will tell you in terms of the policy implications for project delivery is when you think about the funding capacity of states right now, our ability to pay for the infrastructure that we need, we're going to have to be creative in terms of finding additional dollars. We can no longer just depend on the traditional revenue sources to make this happen. So it's forcing us to think about the financial policies of delivering projects across different states, and that's not unique to Louisiana. P3s also introduce a global economy into our national economy for infrastructure here in Louisiana. When you look at the developers and the contractors and the resources that can come to play in our country, it's actually growing the pot of dollars that we have for transportation. So when you can build a bigger economy around infrastructure, you can actually deliver more. And in some cases, because we're all in transportation, we understand the impacts of inflation. It will compensate for what we might lose in buying power of the dollars that we have. And so from a governmental, transportation, and financial policy perspective, P3s introduce that new element. And on the side of this, I should have told you, are pictures of this project that's being developed in Louisiana. P3s also offer innovation. When you think about what the private sector's approach is, they're much more agile than what departments of transportation have historically been. The traditional concept of design, bid, build does not allow for changes to produce additional value as quickly as you might get in a P3 procurement. The other piece about this is that it allows us to be more intentional in doing better with the dollars that we have. And so the ATC process, and I'll talk a little bit about that, the alternative technical concept, introduces things that we don't find oftentimes until a project is built. And that's the wrong time to find, hey, it would be great if we had an off-ramp here. Well, that's not necessarily the most efficient thing to do. The next benefit or policy implication, I should tell you, is it speaks to scale. When you think about the P3 projects that you have available, being procured, that have been procured or on the horizon, they're projects that are typically mega projects. And when you think about the capacity of a state, I'll give you one example. In my 7.5 years as Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, we spent $5.5 to $6 billion on construction alone. There are 2 bridges in Louisiana that are going to cost more than $6.5 billion. So think about that. That would be 7.5 years of projects all across the state, 2,000 projects in lieu of 2 bridges. And so P3s offer us an opportunity to grow the capacity of a project and to deliver that in a meaningful way. And then last but not least, P3s are challenging the way governments think about delivering services. Universities are doing it. Healthcare systems are doing it, where they're learning to share responsibilities. And it's not just risk avoidance. It's risk sharing, risk transferring, what's responsible, what's not. It's also capitalizing projects in a way that we might not normally do it because we don't have enough money or we've got so many different alternatives to do it. So P3s are challenging the framework for project delivery across the spectrum of government. It's happened in education when you look at charters, both from a policy perspective, but also from buildings, when you look at real estate and public-private partnerships and building buildings for governments to then go back in and lease. It's an amazing process. And as I talked about this, P3s offer some political alternatives to making the tough decisions, because the legislature may not be the best place to make some of those decisions. We respect their power, but listen, they're going to hear the squeaky wheel. They're going to hear those folks who just absolutely may not like what they're doing. With the P3 process, you build a buffer to opposition. You build a buffer to disagreement. As long as you have that public engagement process and you do what's in the best interest and you have transparency and all of those things that make for meaningful government, it makes it easier because that company, that developer, that team can focus just on that project. And you as a secretary or a chief engineer or a CFO of an agency at the state level, you can concentrate on the other 9,000 things you have to do tomorrow. That is why this is making a big difference in terms of selling and promoting and building momentum for P3s. Let me talk very quickly about the benefits of P3s, project predictability. And I'm not talking about the procurement, but once a project has been procured and they've reached financial and commercial close, there is predictability in what's going to happen, not just for the contractors, not just for the engineers, not just for the financial market, but for the citizens that we serve. There's nothing more frustrating than telling the public a project is coming, and guess what? It doesn't come because of inflation in cost or challenges with the contractor or unforeseen conditions with utilities or whatever it may be. So this offers some predictability because you've got a contract. You've got a contract that's probably about this thick that details every perceived alternative and option and challenge that that project is going to face over its life. The second thing is the benefit of the value that you're going to get. While P3s may not always be cheaper, believe it or not, they are more tangible in increasing the public value of a project because it has a business imperative to say this has to work. If you think about it, I had a $14 billion unmet need in the state of Louisiana. And the projects that fall on that list are things that we might build, and then they break and they go to the end of the line. That's not the case with a P3 because without a business model, it's no longer going to attract business and they lose their reputation and it doesn't become appealing. And then it goes under and they've built this infrastructure. So the reality is you're going to give value to the citizens as well as to the communities that we serve. You can generate additional revenue. We offer this to a number of communities. When you're developing this, think about other transportation alternatives that can be funded with resources from a P3 if it's successful and if it's built on real numbers and real dollars. The other two factors are life cycle cost of a project. It's going to be maintained much better, as I said, than every other project. It's going to be the best kept bridge in Louisiana for the next 35 years when these tolls open on this infrastructure at the end of this year. That's going to be impressive. And when it comes back to the state, we will have built in all of the interim maintenance that's necessary to ensure that that project, that bridge, maintains its quality and infrastructure. It fosters collaboration, innovation, and creativity to the benefit of the end user. And that alternative technical concept piece, believe it or not, I think is the most efficient tool to giving the public what they want. Because in the process of public engagement, the developers and the design teams get to hear all of this. And when we do things, we do it one way. And there's only one way that I might do it, but there are multiple ways to deliver infrastructure. And the teams can bring creativity into the reality of a project when it's delivered. And so those alternative technical concepts are things that are that aha moment that just absolutely makes sense. And last but not least, this is a novel project delivery. 95% of our projects at the state level are going to always be design, bid, build. But listen, the projects that we choose for P3s are going to represent the majority of the public interest in your state, I would submit to you. The idea that these big gargantuan mega projects represent 80% of the public interest in infrastructure, but less than 1% probably of the projects, is significant. So this is a novel development. And then in closing, I will tell you, P3s are demonstrating that we can evolve. What started off with design, bid, build, it made its way to design, build, and now P3s, progressive design, build. All of these are tools that can be used in a P3 model. The continuum of project delivery continues, and at the end of the day, this is about delivering projects that people have talked about for decades. Giving citizens what they want. This was the first bridge that we built in Louisiana with a public-private partnership. And we've got another project underway right now, as soon as they reach financial close, and hopefully the next couple of weeks. And it's a $2.1 billion project that's been in an environmental process for about 22, 23 years. It's time that we delivered, and P3 is going to be the mechanism by which that's happened. So I thank you for your time. I look forward to any questions and listening to the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Our next panelist joins us from George Mason University and is a national thought leader on transportation. I'd like to welcome Dr. Jonathan Gifford.
Thank you very much. Great. Let's see if I can make this work. I guess all right. So just a little bit about me. I won't spend time on this. Thank you for your introduction. I am a civil engineer in a public policy school. That's where I spent my life. So I'm very interested in the technology and how it buttons up against finance, institutions, public policy, and so forth. I head a center, and our mission really is objective consideration of P3s as a mechanism for delivering value. And, I emphasize that word objective. We're not advocates for that. We are trying to help owners and other stakeholders understand where this approach that, Sean talked about makes sense. So I guess, these concepts, we've touched on a couple of them. Bundling, I think, putting together the phases of product delivery really is the essence of the P3 model, and trying to, figure out how to do that using key performance indicators, pavement smoothness, quickness of response to emergency events, and so forth, that are written into that contract Sean mentioned, with financial consequences if they're not met. The risk sharing, I'll talk about a bit more in a moment, and then, getting access to private capital markets, which Sean mentioned, the capacity to access for mega projects, bringing that private capital to bear on the needs of a state or a jurisdiction. This, I won't go into it in detail, is just an example of a risk register. You can see a long list of, environmental approvals, permits, so on and so forth. The key takeaway is, on the left, design, bid, build, the blue rectangles, almost all of the risk there is borne by the state. As you move to a more public-private partnership model on the right, you can see a lot of those are green. They're borne by the private sector, and we'll talk about consequences, what happens when things go wrong. Some of the yellow ones shared, a few of them retained by the public sector. They can't really effectively be shifted. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Sean touched on these already. Transaction costs are a concern, but access to markets, improved budget and schedule adherence, accelerated delivery, bringing projects forward, sometimes decades, so that you're not talking about projects, that were in the pipeline when you were a child, that still are not delivered. So bringing the, access of private capital to bring that to bear is really important. Let's see here. So we didn't touch on bankruptcy. It's not usually a favorable thing. I'm sort of known as Dr. Doom. I didn't study law, but it's important to understand that for the owner, the municipality or the state, our bankruptcy system in the US provides an extraordinary amount of protection for the owner when things go wrong. And I want to illustrate that with two examples. One is, an example where it worked. The Indiana Toll Road, some of you may have heard about this project. It was one of the early P3s in the US market, a $3.8 billion payment to the state of Indiana for the right to improve and operate and collect tolls on their toll road that had been built in the 1950s, for a period of 75 years. Well, they closed before the great financial crisis. As it happened, the way they structured their finances meant their interest costs exploded when the financial crisis hit. So many of us saw rates go down. For them, the way they'd leveraged it, the rates went up to $2 billion. And so what happened? In 2014, they filed for bankruptcy. They went to court. The investors, Cintra, Macquarie, known companies in this state, lost about $750 million. The state kept its $3.8 billion. The road operation was never interrupted. And so the balance sheet of the state was protected. As it happened, I was teaching my P3 course for the first time in 2014, and we did a study in August and read about it. They went bankrupt in September. The president of Cintra came and talked to my class in November. It was like, this is an instructor's dream. Can we do this every semester? The president said, we hate it when it happens, but we are bidding to take that company out of bankruptcy. They knew the project, so it was their financing that did it. Now, the counterexample is Texas Highway State 121. Another Sintra project, as it happens, the state awarded a P3 to Sintra to build this roadway, a couple $2 billion project. A public agency, the North Texas Tollway Agency, which runs their toll collection and also a network of highways in the region, went to the legislature. They wanted the project. They got the legislature to give them the power to step ahead of the P3, which they did. What happened? They started to build the project. We had the great financial crisis. Demand, for toll roads and toll revenues went to the floor. NTTA's credit ratings were reduced from A+ to BBB+. They had to raise the tolls on their whole system by 37% in order to keep from defaulting on the loans that they'd taken out to build this project. If it had been a P3, that would have fallen to the private investors as opposed to falling to the public balance sheet. Another point I think is really important is, again, it's a Texas example as it happens, but I know there are folks from MPOs in the region here, or in the room here. P3 is really on offer a way for you to take control of your own destiny. The head of the MPO in Austin, Michael Morris, had these comments. It's allowed our region to shape its own destiny on its own schedule. Not waiting for Austin, the state capital, not waiting for Washington, the national capital. We can move at our own pace, on our own schedule, to address the vision that we have for our region in a timely and efficient, way. So that's, I think, an important lesson to keep in mind. And the last thing I want to mention is just, my home area, Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C., this crude map, pardon my hand-drawn lines there, but the red lines are our managed lane and P3 network in the region. And I think it's worth thinking about, here in North Carolina, how do you want to develop the regions in the state and at the state level, and what we've done. So this last slide here just shows some of the information about projects that have been delivered so far in the 21st century and a couple from the late 20th century. If you look at the cost line there, $600 million, $5.7 billion, $3.7 billion, $500 million, $500 million, $900 million. These are large projects, complex to deliver, that would take the regional, typical traditional funding structures a long time to put in place. And the last thing I'll say, I just pick up on a point that Sean made. Depending on how you want to structure these deals, it gives you the capacity to ask the developers to either provide funding for, say, public transit, even to deliver innovative public transit in a way. And, transit is a high priority for many public officials. The industry is, struggling now. As a public policy matter, you can agree or disagree with using toll revenue to support transit. But if that's what the policymakers want, and that's what the voters are willing to do, it is a way. And we've seen significant contributions to transit, $800 million in the I-66 express lanes over the duration of that contract, $15 million a year, subject to inflation. I think in the first 4 years of the 395 contract, over $60 million have been provided to the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, which is the body that distributes transit subsidies in the Northern Virginia area. So you can craft these contracts to reflect the priorities of the policymakers in the regions that you represent and serve. And I think it's a great tool that brings all of the benefits that Sean mentioned, innovation, speed, access to private capital, and so forth. So I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gifford. Our next panelist joins us from the state of Georgia, Georgia Department of Transportation, our good friends down there, and we'd like to welcome Helen Pinkston Pope.
Good morning. I'm so glad to be with y'all and with my fellow panelists here to talk about P3 and our experience in Georgia. By way of introduction, I am Helen Pinkston Pope, and just as of last week, I am serving as the Commercial Advisory Administrator in the P3 division at Georgia DOT. Previously, I was in legal services under the General Counsel. But in my new role, and really in my previous role, I coordinate with my legal, financial, and technical colleagues at the department. And as you can even see from the makeup of our panel, and that's what it takes to do a P3 project, is the coordination of legal, financial, engineering to come together and deliver a P3. But one of my primary functions in my role is to look at the commercial terms of our contracts. I've been at DOT for going on 11 years, and I came over from the Attorney General's office, and before that from private practice doing construction litigation. I say that because I think it's all relevant to what we do when we're developing these thick contracts. Along the way, I developed my experience working more on design build and then more and more on our P3 program. And I'll get to more of our different contracting methods towards the end. But what, kind of along with what I was talking about with the different areas of expertise at our Department of Transportation, we've recently added more expertise into our P3 division for more of that coordination, so that we will have a strong owner with department employees looking at those alternative technical concepts as they come in, and have people who are really focused on P3 in our post-let space, so all within our P3 division. I just offer that to anyone who's looking at strengthening or getting more involved in P3s, whether in North Carolina or elsewhere. Because we find that the private partners on the other side of a P3 are looking for a strong owner or someone that they can count on there. But before we even get to that, in Georgia, like in other states, like North Carolina, there's a public-public partnership. But in Georgia, we have the Georgia DOT and the State Road and Tollway Authority. And at DOT, where I work, we're responsible for all the pre-let activities, the environmental, all of that, as well as the procurement. And then during construction, we serve as the project manager. So we're coordinating there with the developer along the way. The State Road and Tollway Authority executes the contracts, makes any payments to the developer, and has the authority to toll, to impose tolls. And in Georgia, the legal authority to toll, there are two bases to toll. I'm not going to go too far into it, but I did want to say that one of the legal bases to toll is related to reducing congestion. So I think that's really important, because as we're talking to the public and doing that public outreach before any project, it's tolling and express lanes is about reducing congestion and given that choice. So in the State Road and Tollway, that's written into their part of the code and their authority to impose a toll. So at the beginning of every project that it's either a P3, and we can do P3s that aren't toll roads, but are toll lanes. But at the beginning of any project that we're undertaking together, the boards of the Georgia DOT, the State Transportation Board, and the State Road and Tollway Authority enter a joint resolution. And that authorizes both agencies at the beginning of a project to undertake that project and sets out our roles. Practically, that document sets out all the legal authority and documents the support and those roles. But what it also gives us is a piece of paper, and it kind of documents the support. So during the procurement, when people say, oh, is there political support for this project? Is there support from the leadership of your state? We can say, yes, look, on this date, the State Transportation Board passed this joint resolution, and then usually it's the next month, or shortly thereafter, the State Road and Tollway Authority Board passed a joint resolution, and it demonstrates support, and that's helpful sometimes with the Build America Bureau. But I wanted to show you who it is that's voting on that joint resolution and who are these people on these boards, because every state is unique, and as a longtime public employee at this point, I'm sort of a policy nerd. So at our side, at the DOT, we have a 14-member board, and there's one member for every congressional district. And those members are voted on by a delegation from our General Assembly, from members of that who are from that district. So they're not appointed by the governor, and they have staggered terms from members of that who are, if their district touches like 14, if they're from, and they, you know how state districts are, Senate and House, they don't exactly correspond, but if their district happens to touch that, then they get to vote on State Transportation Board number whatever. So that's how it works. And we have a lot of long-serving board members and then some that turn over more, and that's just how it is. And those board members appoint the GDOT commissioner, which is the equivalent of the secretary. Now, on the CERTA side, the governor is the chair of the CERTA board, and then there are a couple of appointees, and the Office of Planning and Budget Director, that person is appointed by the governor. So, and then the GDOT commissioner is always a member of the CERTA board by statute. So those are our two boards that are most relevant to P3. But again, at the beginning of the procurement, the boards enter the joint resolution, and then at the end of the procurement, when we have a best value winner, according to the evaluation criteria, that winner of the contract goes to the State Transportation Board for approval of the award, and then the contract is executed by the executive director of CERTA. But there's no further government approvals, and we find that reduces political risk to the procurement. So that's good. And we have the clarity, because it's all set out in the joint resolution in the beginning. Now, as far as what we're working on, just last week, the State Transportation Board approved the joint resolution for 2 upcoming projects, which will be express lanes projects, the 285 East Express Lanes and 285 West Express Lanes. They also approved use of an alternative contracting method, which is a comprehensive development agreement for both of those projects. So we're pretty excited about that, and the State Road and Tollway Authority will take up that joint resolution at their upcoming board meeting in June. But we anticipate starting the procurement of the East Express Lanes, 285 East, in coming months. We're pretty excited. And that is a P3 using the CDA method. It's a demand risk DBFOM project. Finally, our first demand risk DBFOM P3 is in procurement right now. We had 2 responsive proposals which are under evaluation, and we anticipate the award of that project to come up very shortly. So I can't say much more about it because we're in procurement. And really quickly, I just wanted to say that those are the most high-profile projects. They get all the attention, but we have a really big program in Georgia, and we have a lot of options. We have a really long-standing now design-build program and a lot of projects. And all of this is under our P3 division. We had our first CMGC project is underway right now. Well, it's selected and it's not coming out of the ground yet, but it's still underway. We have design-build finance. We've had a couple of those that are successful, and one that is in construction. One is also in procurement, a very large one. And we have all these options. And so we think it's really good to have a P3 statute and design-build statute, all these, like the legal flexibility, so that when you're looking at funding options, you have a wide variety of choices for your leadership to choose from. So that would be my recommendation. So, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Our last presenter today is Mike McDermott. We'd like to welcome Mike. Mike is with the Build America Bureau at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Come on up, Mike.
All right, good morning, everyone. It's hard to see with the lights here, so I apologize. All right, let's do this here. So my experience with P3s goes back to some of the projects that were mentioned earlier, including the Indiana Toll Road and some others. The theme that you'll see through my slides is, as was mentioned by the prior speaker, I think I'm the bad guy here, character actor. My role in the industry has been at a rating agency where project sponsors and lenders always viewed us as the bad guy. Then I was an investor, viewed as a bad guy, and now I'm at the Build America Bureau, which sometimes has negative connotations with it as well in terms of our speed of getting things done and making funding available. So anyway, the experience goes back to the initial transactions that were done for toll roads, largely SR 125, Pocahontas Parkway, asset monetization like Indiana Toll Road, Chicago Skyway, and then the industry started to morph as more entities became interested in tapping, what was viewed by many in the investment world as a large market. So the projects turned from asset monetization and just the standard toll road to managed lanes, which is an interesting sort of technical evolution of the highway system, water system privatization, and then sort of a move into social infrastructure, which is the way a lot of projects are delivered outside of the U.S. So courthouses, some transit, government buildings, campus living, campus parking, campus energy, airport-related infrastructure. So I've seen things across that spectrum. They start life off at BBB-, and some find their way to default. Others have started off at that sort of point in their life to get into the capital markets. Essentially, you need an investment grade rating, and then they improve over time and perform well. So the next step in my experience with P3s was on the other side of the table, and that would be directly lending money to project sponsors. And that was a combination of P3s and then sort of what I'm going to call more typical project delivery for energy, transportation, and water infrastructure, and sort of typical government projects. And I think it's, having spent a lot of time as a participant in the municipal market, I would say that we're fortunate in that we have a very robust way to deliver projects away from a P3. The P3 is a very useful tool, as the prior panelists have mentioned, and as we'll talk about going forward. But there are other ways to do it as well that allow for some of the technical benefits of a risk transfer, but also keep the funding in the municipal market, which is a lower cost of capital. And then finally, from an experience perspective, I've been at the Build America Bureau for a year and a half. I'm head the portfolio management team, which is where we actually disperse funds once the loan's executed. That's the easy part of the job, signing checks, making people happy. Then it involves looking at and negotiating amendments and consents and waivers, and that always comes up, particularly when there's a large, complicated project with a complex financial structure and contractual framework. As was mentioned, the documents for these things are huge. They're very intertwined, and inevitably things are going to come up that no one either anticipated, or there's a discussion process for trying to work them out. So we work with project sponsors and governments on that, and then probably you're not going to be happy to see me at the end if the project is done, because we also handle workouts, which is when the project goes bad. So I guess in summarizing my experience, I would say that P3s are very useful tools, but they may not be right for every project or for every project sponsor. And by project sponsor, I mean governmental entity. All right, let's see here. Next one. So by design, the P3 is transferring risk, and it can be just transferring completion or construction risk to construction and finance, to long-term operations and maintenance, and then the whole sort of spectrum of project delivery, finance, and long-term maintenance. And the more of that is involved in the contract, I think the more risk is being transferred to a private entity, and that means, from a project sponsor perspective, more homework needs to be done internally on politics and stakeholders. And I think the key question around this is, what problem are we trying to solve? And what's the best way to solve it? Go through that, spend a lot of time on that, and then you may come to the conclusion of this particular project delivery method is the best way. The other important thing is that there needs to be a strong champion or set of champions for this particular project through the years it's going to take to get the project through to development. So once you've figured out the policy, then you can move into preparing stakeholders and the political aspect of it. Let's see here. That leads you to think about, what is, as a governmental entity, what's my cost of capital? Meaning, what does it cost me if I go out and borrow for a portion or all of the project? And what does that cost me in terms of how much debt I can issue for other projects, right? If you asked every state legislature, every state governor, every state budget official, do they have enough money to do the things they need to do, they're all going to say no. It's just a function of government. There's always a competing list of projects across various, modes or sectors of infrastructure. So, understanding what it's going to cost you is really important. And then also the cost of equity, meaning if you've got to put in cash up front, like what's the cost of that? What can't you do if you do this? So understanding that's very important. Then you want to think about, okay, if I'm going to go down this road of this alternative delivery method, what's the cost of debt and equity for the negotiating partner on the other side of the table? Because that's a different thing. Their cost of capital may be similar if they can use the tax-exempt market or get a TIFIA loan as an example, but their cost of equity is very different. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you do this. Then you want to think about your core competencies and where would help be beneficial, or where are you strong and you don't need help. And then finally, is there a unique or tricky design aspect? The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, did a P3 for one of their bridges, and I think a large part of the rationale there was not because they don't have experience managing large transportation infrastructure, because they've got a nearly 100-year experience at that, but they were trying to reconstruct a bridge that had height issues given Newark Airport and height issues underneath it given container ships coming in. So they brought in third parties to help with alternative technical concepts to deliver a project that maybe they might not have done that way on their own. And once you've sort of gone through that list of things, I sort of think about it as a matrix. One of the slides earlier had some of those things laid out. I think it's really critical to go through that, but once you do that, then you can sort of go through your, public information campaign, as I would call it, getting buy-in that this is the problem we're trying to solve, these are the options for trying to solve the problem. And I think describing the pros and cons of that in an open way help with the ultimate delivery of the project if the P3 option or a more what I'm going to call typical delivery solution is used. Big infrastructure projects have challenges from day one. They take a long time, they take a lot of effort, whether the state does it itself, whether the state uses a tolling authority that was created, or if a private sector entity is used. There's a long list of projects that have run into problems after they've been sort of approved and started to move forward. And so just, I think, understanding that and anticipating it and setting up your procurement process to recognize that is really important. And then I think the final thing I'd say, Mike, the clock's running out here, and I probably bored you, is to learn from the mistakes of others. And there are a lot of them out there. Chicago parking meters, the Chicago Skyway, Pennsylvania Turnpike, US 460, Great Hall was an airport transaction, I-69, Alabama prisons. There are a whole host of things where either the political part of the process wasn't nailed down and it was, the project was sort of jammed forward, as I would say, and it blew up, or the risk transfer wasn't contemplated properly and there was a problem. So delivering any infrastructure project is complicated and time-consuming. And I think as project sponsors, the best time you can spend is the upfront time thinking through all of these things first to prepare yourself for what's the right way to deliver it and then move forward. And with that, I'll wrap up.
Thank you, Mike. All right, now we're going to move into the portion of the the presentation that I like the best. I like to just have the dialogue going back and forth. So I will say one thing about that Mike made me think about one of his last comments there about doing all the upfront work. It reminds me of a slogan, think slow and act fast, right? And so that's a good way to look at it. All right, so let's start with a quick question and probably a simple question, and I'm gonna look at Jonathan for this one. Just in a couple of sentences, Jonathan, what is a P3?
All right. Well, I've been on this for 11 years. I guess I might. I'll do a summary. Risk transfer. I think private sector engagement and private capital market engagement, alternative technical concepts, and I think outreach, preparation. Probably an underappreciated thing about P3s is that, every project has challenges, and one of the values of a well-done P3 process is it exposes those challenges up front. And not only to the contractors, not only to the state DOT, but to the legislators and the public, and having that clarity, is really important, because a lot, sometimes, I know you can't imagine this happening, but project proponents want to hide problems and get the project approved and started, and then, when things blow up later, you've already got, a hole in the ground, and you got to keep going. Trying to get, and that leads to pain, I think. So P3 has a tendency to shed light on that, and I think that can bring great value to the project development process. Probably kills some projects, but it's important that be exposed.
Yeah. Any other comments? Anything y'all want to add? Okay. Mike, from your experience financing these complicated projects, what strategies would you recommend to DOTs and planning organizations as they explore funding options for a potential P3 delivery?
States and local governments are asset managers, and they deliver projects, right? So I think starting off with that mindset and looking at your own sort of financial profile, meaning these are all the assets I have that I manage, the highways, bridges, county roads, et cetera. This is what O&M is going to cost me over the next 10 years. These are the conditions I want the roads to be in. Going through that and then thinking about what are the problems that we're going to try and solve, new projects or resiliency, And okay, now I know that I'm short X over a certain amount of time. So taking the upfront steps to think through that can then say, oh, this project should be done in this way, and I can make that work, and that makes sense. But I think, that detailed planning process and having the conversations with the stakeholders is really important. And it can lead you to that answer. And that, I think, makes then the process of getting the project over the finish line without having to hide the problems is good. Because when that happens, and you have that on both sides, right? You have political sponsors who have a limited time frame, and you have, if it's a P3, you have financial sponsors that have a limited time frame too, and they've got investors' money that's got to earn a 15% rate of return, and they don't want it just sitting there forever. So I think that thinking through that process and knowing the puts and takes. If I ask for this, it's going to cost me. If I give that, there's a benefit to that. So going through that grid and being prepared so that you can act fast. Ultimately is, I think, the key.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? I think I was thinking of the example of I forget the name of the station on the Washington Metro system. It's one of the Montgomery County suburban stations. They were thinking of redeveloping this station. And so the planners, the real estate management folks at Metro thought that they could get, 800 apartments into this Strathmore station. And, when they opened it up to a developer, the developer came forward with a proposal for, 2,500 units. 800, 2,500. I mean, these people in Metro are not, they're smart people. But developers think about things in different ways. So I think I was, struck by that. When you say you're cataloging your assets and, the requirements, there's also opportunities that the assets that, the public entities manage that the public managers may never think of. And so I think being open to unsolicited proposals, if you want to call them that, opening the door to say, well, here are the assets we have. Here's our mission to create value for the public and deliver services to the public. Are there assets, that we have that could be used to generate value, and that's an important, Even I did a great study with the World Bank on railroad station redevelopment. Got to travel over the world to see railroad stations, and one of the biggest problems inside a railroad system is that the rail people have all this real estate, and they don't want to give it up to the station people who are going to commercialize it. It's like, we're using that. It's convenient. We've been using it for a year. And the fact that it's right in the middle of a city on land that is worth, has huge market value. So a lot of times, even within an agency, these tensions can exist.
Well, building on both of what they said, we at Georgia DOT were looking at an express lanes project, for example, and had originally conceived of it as an availability payment P3, which involves the state paying a set payment for the term of the P3 contract in exchange for the developer making that facility available every year, right? But then we were looking at the side, what a financial commitment that is, and looking at that chunk of money. It's like, we have a really big program, a lot of projects in that program. What is a way to maybe optimize the use of the public funding? Maybe reconsider that and look at, if we change to a demand risk, also known as revenue risk, P3, would that perhaps align the interest of the private sector? Maybe this reminds me of what you just said, Dr. Gifford, about the private sector in your example, finding 2,400 units instead of 800. Like on an express lanes project, we found that maybe the private sector could bring in even more ATCs, not just like change in pavement design, but really optimizing the access points, drawing on the private sector experience in operating toll facilities and improving the user experience based on their market, participants who have really experience across the nation and internationally operating toll facilities, right? And if you align their risk and their interests in a project by giving them demand risk, they're more incentivized to bring forward more dramatic ATCs.
Right.
And bring the innovation into the project during the procurement. And that's a way for the public to get more value out of the project. And so it's reconsidering. So we had to, like, oh, well, perhaps this is a better deal for the citizens of Georgia. So we'll see, right? And I'm not saying that availability payment projects don't have a place, but maybe for a different type of project. I mean, we still have one in our plan, but it's not a toll project.
Right.
It's a policy choice, right? Because for an availability payment structure on a toll road or an asset that generates revenue, right? In that case, the government's deciding to retain the policy control of how I set tolls. Do I want them to maximize revenue and maximize profit, which is what your private counterparty wants, or do I want to, generate enough revenue to support the asset so that my cost is zero, but I'm not maximizing it? And that's the trade-off between
I'll say it's
the two.
still, in our case, the State Road and Tollway Authority, well, we can't totally, there's still a contractual mechanism that we can't just give that away.
And at the end of the day, you've got to throw in that you're trying to maintain the reliability of the travel time too. So that's got to be an important factor in all of that.
That's right.
Yeah. Sean, successes in Louisiana. Can you want to maybe highlight what in your mind was in the P3 strategy that allowed the projects to be successes?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, as I said in my presentation, delivering projects that people have talked about for decades, and no one had the courage or the confidence or the credibility or the craziness to try something totally different. The other piece is it introduced or reintroduced a concept that allows for other alternatives and the flexibility that someone talked about. And so the Belle Chase Bridge and Tunnel is in the shadows of a major bridge that we took tolls off that produced about $25 to $30 million profit a year. And we eliminated tolls as opposed to repurposing those $30 million because tolls and user fees were a bad thing. So the idea of reintroducing tolls into P3, it improved the policy because our legislature reduced tolls 3 times and didn't reduce the expectations or obligations. With a contract, you limit the exposure for those types of not so smart or sustainable decisions. And so it introduced a policy component. It delivered things for the first time that citizens have talked about and wanted. We were able to pre-identify 4 projects that had toll feasibility or revenue feasibility and innovative feasibility that we were able to bring to the market and allow the market to reply to us. And then the last thing I'll tell you is with the federal government moving to a discretionary model for about 10% of its funding, using these novel approaches that are creating innovation as an example is attractive. So it is a competitive advantage to use, I believe, some of these innovative delivery models because we see that P3s only happen in urban areas. Well, we prove that it can happen in a small or rural area. We prove that you don't have to have a $1 billion project. You can have a $200 million project, and you can learn to decrease the cost of competition in that process. And then it allows us to then have an all-of-the-above approach. So we use PABs, private activity bonds. We use TIFIA on the project. We use discretionary grants on the project. And we were able, to a certain extent, to bring some availability payment concepts, maybe not in the total project cost, but we were able to bring that to bear as well for these big mega projects that are going to cost 5 years of my entire program or 4 years of my entire program. And so we were able to smooth that out. And we had innovation happening. We had design build, construction manager at risk, P3, privatization, some minor asset recycling, all happening at the same time. And so the inertia of what was created all started with this effort to do something other than design, bid, build. And we did it in a way that engaged the public, engaged legislators, which isn't always great. Sometimes it's a challenge, as you said. But if that project doesn't make, then that's proven it can't go that route, and you can go back to the drawing board to do something alternative.
Yeah.
So it really did move, I think, the policy needle for us as a state and how we approach transportation. And then the last thing I'll say, I've got preacher in my blood, so I can close 3 times. But the last thing, it says that, you know, the idea that these projects may or may not make is important. And it's going to force us to say we just can't do some things sometimes. And I appreciate the fact that this model and this process worked from my window, but I only had 4 years in the first term and 4 years in the second term. And then you got to deliver that and hand that baby off to another administration or another leader or another group that might not necessarily have the same knowledge or agree, but you've got a partner and you rely on that partner to help carry the ball on that project. And that is what I'm seeing, for example, on the Calcasieu Bridge, $2.1 billion. We nursed it for 3 years of procurement, and in 3 months, a new administration that was the antithesis of the previous administration is delivering the project. And that's a good thing for those citizens. It's a good thing for the community, for the industry, and that partner is going to be a critical player in making sure it happens, not necessarily me as the secretary or as the representative that kind of ushered that along.
Yeah, that's good. You made me think of another question, and it's one of the questions that I had, but I'm going to phrase it a little bit differently. You said that y'all were able to prove that there was a smaller project or a rural project that like wouldn't traditionally get looked at as a P3, but like what projects do work the best in the P3 model? Like, let's follow up, and I'd like to hear from all of you if we've got time. So
I'll just say very quickly, when you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3.
That's right.
I don't think you can pigeonhole or put anything in a box to say, check these boxes, it will work. Because the electorate is different. The logistics are different. Heck, you might have a Chick-fil-A down there, and that's going to mess up all your traffic. So it's every project is different. That's a good thing. I love Chick-fil-A. My grandchildren love Chick-fil-A even more than I do. So they're all different. But the idea is that this framework allows you to make the questions, understand the problems on the front end, and know what you can bring to bear. Know that you're not the one maybe to manage the complexity of pipelines or rail or chemical spill or EJ issue, environmental justice issues. You get to get help with that. So I don't know that you can say it will work everywhere, but this framework and process can be applied to multiple projects where you then make informed decisions collectively.
Jonathan?
Yeah, so question is, what makes a P3?
Well, which projects sort of suit themselves for P3s, I guess, is another way to ask it.
Yeah, well, I think, the U.S. market is a very fragmented market. So, 50 states, District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico. We have a lot of different legal structures, parishes in Louisiana, counties in other places. So it's a very, very diverse market. And I think, mega projects have supported the transaction costs that are involved with going into a Louisiana market or a North Carolina market or a Virginia market and figuring out how do we do business here as a global developer? What are the institutions and how does that work? I think as we get up the learning curve, then the project scale can begin to come down. I mean, Canada's doing, $30 million, $40 million projects. They have a more uniform governance system. One of the slides I didn't use was, I think we have, what was the number? 80,000 units of government in the United States, not including the feds, which could be 1 or
Multiple.
So another 80, I don't know, another 80,000 maybe, but, we're very, very decentralized country. And, there's 50,000 issuers in the municipal bond market. It's an extraordinarily, school districts, park districts, and all of that. So I think as we develop norms and people are more accustomed to the model, we can adapt it to other types of projects. We're never going to get a, sort of a US DOT template contract that just says, you got to use this contract to make it work. It's got to be fitted into our, one person called it, bewildering variety of institutional setups in the US. And, and that's a feature, not a bug. That's something that we as Americans have chosen and for important reasons. So that's sort of a backwards way of answering your question, but I think it really, it has to be context specific, and as we learn to do it better, I think smaller and smaller projects will be able to pick and choose and say, this really works for the challenge or the opportunity that we're trying to pursue.
Any thoughts?
I'd say we're looking at a full P3, long-term operations and maintenance might be a consideration. Like a project that has this easily separated long-term operations and maintenance, that would make sense. So for us, express lanes, obviously we've chosen P3 for that, but also we consider design, build, finance P3, which some people don't. So that's without the operations and maintenance, but we've used that P3 Lite for large interchange projects and have had success with that. So those are some thoughts I have.
The industry will tell you what works or not.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Mike, anything?
Yeah, I would just say, the operations and maintenance is an interesting part of these. Again, back to as a governmental entity, I'm an asset manager, right? Like, you can deliver a project in a normal way, completely successfully. You retain controls over the revenue generation if you do it that way. But longer term, the operations and maintenance competes against all the other political needs of the government that changes over time. So what you wind up seeing is in 15 years, you see asset degradation and higher operating costs, and then now you've got this asset that needs to be plugged back into the mix of things you're thinking about. So it does add what's the right word I'm looking for? Sort of accountability and better asset maintenance and performance over time. Comes at a cost, but it does that. So I think that, along with the innovative aspect, like can you add some additional exit or entrance ramps, or can you design the bridge in this way, or the water system, or whatever the example is. There are benefits there for sure.
Okay. So we're going to open it up for maybe a couple of audience questions, if there are any. I think Tanner and maybe, I can't see, but maybe it's Sarah, Stacy. Anyway, they're walking around with microphones.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Alexis Rosenberg. I'm an attorney at Ashurst. This is probably a question maybe for Helen or Sean or yourself, Chris, where you have experience implementing a P3 from the owner's perspective. So the last P in P3 is partnership. And I guess for those in the room from the owner's perspective that are considering a P3 or trying to understand a P3, do you have any sort of tangible advice on how to make it a real partnership? Whether that's in the terms of your contract, the approach to the procurement, or how you manage post-let. How do you really get the most out of the partnership to serve the DOT's interest and get the most out of the private sector?
I don't mind jumping in if you guys don't mind. Just in general, whether it's a P3 or not, I mean, viewing the way you view partnerships, in my opinion, as a state DOT is, going back to some things that Mike said, what problem am I trying to solve, right? And so when you get to to a problem scenario in a complicated delivery model, and you've got lots of different entities that are involved and lots of different stakeholders. I think at the end of the day, you know, you're looking for somebody that you can have conversations with, that you're going to move that needle that you're trying to move. And so I would say I'd like to advocate that anybody in this room that's trying to go about starting down something that's this complicated, and it could just, it might not even be a P3, it might just be one of these other innovative methods of delivering projects. I think, you know, make sure you got people that understand how those mechanisms work and are advising you correctly. You know, and in a P3, you're going to need legal advice, you're going to need technical advice. You probably need some sort of communications plan, and you're going to really have to understand who your stakeholders are. And you're going to have to build partnerships with those communities too, and make sure that you're addressing all the things that those communities need, and that you're being as transparent with them as you possibly can, and trying to share as much information with them as you possibly can while you're dealing with a complex negotiation that sometimes requires like non-disclosure. I think it's just being a genuine partner, just approaching it like you want to be treated. Like, I want to treat that partner like I want to be treated by that partner. And so, and then maybe we can come together and put a frame around what our problem is that we're trying to solve, and then maybe we can get there. So,
I'll tell you, as an owner, the developer team is looking for the right partner, just like the owner's looking for a partner. Mm-hmm. And I know we've got chamber folks here, some local government folks here, and agency folks. You need to make sure that the leader, the decision maker, the person that's ultimately responsible is in the room and engaged. As a CEO, I participated in nearly every one-on-one. I was there, and that demonstrated a level of partnership and priority such that that team knew we could make things happen. Because sometimes you had to reprioritize the department's priorities to satisfy the needs of the procurement. And I would also tell you that you have to trust the person that you put in charge. This is not something for just an average Joe to come in and negotiate. You've got to have confidence that your CEO, your chief engineer, whoever you have leading that effort, the person that's sitting in Helen's shop knows this business and knows what to do. And knows, and the one thing that you missed, Chris, that you didn't specify was a financial advisor as well to be able to review this, to look at what's in your best interest, because this is a very complex process. You're rolling in a 50-year contract into one agreement you're going to sign in about 5-10 minutes, maybe 15-20 minutes at the end of the day with the number of times you sign it. But it's very comprehensive, and it's very complex. And so you need to not change staff, you need to not have high turnover, and you need someone in the room who can actually make a decision and speak for the entire agency with the confidence of the people that have empowered them. That is the best thing you can do to demonstrate partnership and return phone calls.
Yeah.
I agree with all of that. It's really important to have that engagement. But to touch on one other aspect of the question, what can you put in the contract? One part of what we've been doing at DOT, my DOT, is really looking at those parts of the contract that were in that category of shared risk in your slide, Dr. Gifford. That, you know, that's where it gets tricky. So how could we improve the terms of our contract that where it's shared, where there's a shared risk, whether that's utilities or right-of-way? I mean, what if the DOT is more in a better place to help with those shared areas of risk? What can we do, and what can we put in the contract about that without losing the benefit of the public-private partnership? We don't want to lose the benefit of the model for the state. But we're trying to really say, if DOT can do stuff before in pre-let, right, ahead of time, can we buy more right-of-way ahead of time before it even goes to the developer? But for the utility conflicts, if the state utilities office at DOT has those relationships with the utilities just from our regular program, which we do. How can we leverage that in the terms of our contract, even a P3 contract, right? Because it's still a DOT contract, at the end of the day. So how can we leverage those relationships in those areas of shared risk? That's just an example. But we kind of went through our P3 contract and said, it's still a P3, there's still P3 risk allocation, but what can we do? And so to be a good partner and still be the DOT. And that's part of being a good partner.
Do we have another question? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll just add 30 seconds. These are the partnership aspect, right? You guys mentioned, right? They can go for 35, 50, 70 years. So thinking through the framework up front about what performance indicators do I want monitored, what's the process for resolving them, what's the process for announcing toll increases to the public, all those things up front allow you to handle changes in staff on both the developer side and the DOT side. But that arrangement up front is what helps keep that partnership sort of going. Because if it's not there, then it's finger pointing about, well, it doesn't specify how well you're supposed to maintain the asset or how quickly you're supposed to respond to accidents or whatever. And then it becomes
that's a good point.
A train wreck.
I think we call it legacy. You want to have a legacy.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Hello, thanks so much for your panel. It's been fantastic. My name is Alberto Bravo. I've been working P3s for the last 11 years, and I just was wondering, how do you prevent the risk transfer pendulum from swinging too far to the private sector? Because risk avoidance generally leads to inflated bids and a reduced number of actual bidders. So I was wondering if you guys have experience kind of balancing that risk transfer in the contracts of P3s. Thank you.
I would answer that with the word partnership, but then I'll let some other folks jump in.
I will tell you, it's a great question, by the way. That's why having that executive in the room to read the body language, to hear the words of saying, this is a no-go, go decision point for us. Because it's easy to be greedy and say, oh, we want this, particularly when it comes to those shared responsibilities. Oh, we don't want any of that work. Well, the reality is you've got to be honest. At some point, there's a diminishing return for your resistance to engage equitably, I would say, with a partner. And it's a case-by-case scenario. And so having the right person in the room to gauge what that is and how much you ought to give and whether or not you believe the other side of the table when they say, if this is in our agreement, we can't compete. Understanding the market, understanding the industry, being engaged in panels like this or going to the conferences that are out there where you can hear what that risk is. I mean, the professor will tell you a while back we had very few people wanting to play in design build, the big contractors, because of some of the damage that had been done to them. Understanding those dynamics will help me do a better job of negotiating those shared risks and how to manage the expectation of what comes back to the state or what goes back to the developer side. And so being aware of what's happening in the system and the industry is super important to understand, you know, are they greedy? Are they hungry? Are they aggressive? Is it a buyer or a seller's market? Understanding those dynamics does influence what I'm willing to put on the table or keep for risk. Particularly, you know, and Helen made the point, if I've got the relationship with the CEO of all of the Class 1 railroads and I've got to move this interchange, you're going to need me in that room. I can't just give that to a developer and expect it to work. You know, if I've permitted a pipeline, I can tell you, give me that pipeline back, take it out my right-of-way. That developer can't do that. And so understanding those opportunities and leveraging them is super important.
I'll say another point is during the one-on-one process, so during the procurement, we really like to say, let's lean on this disclaimer. So we have confidential negotiations during the procurement in the form of one-on-one meetings. And if the DOT is saying, well, we just want you to price the risk, we need the private counterpart, the proposer team, to say, well, that's how much it's going to cost you. because it needs to be an open dialogue under that disclaimer, so that we can get a realistic view of how much. If we make the mistake of saying price the risk for every single risk, we need to know how much that's going to cost, right?
And when all three teams give you a price, believe it.
Yeah, but because I think that negotiation in the one-on-one meetings, that's really benefited us. That kind of goes back to the partnership discussion as well. And what DOTs can do is be flexible and listen and be willing to change terms where we can, where it's recognizing it's a business decision sometimes, not. So, part of my job is to say, is it a legal decision or is it a business decision? And decide, be willing to be a little bit flexible. And if we want to be able to afford the project, right? Yeah,
I guess the only thing I would add, having never been involved in a transaction, so I can be completely objective, is to say, that as I understand the process, that the DOTs are going out to the market early on and doing market sounding, and what can we do with this? Are we conceiving the project right? What are the risks that could be, managed effectively by the private sector, and which are, those that really we have to retain, and that's important to be open through, not just at the one-on-one level, but from the very beginning, as you scope and think through the process, to be open to sort of to that aspect of it.
So that's going to conclude our session. I want to sincerely thank our panelists. I've enjoyed getting to spend time with them over the last couple of weeks, virtually and in person. And I really appreciate your thoughts, and you've been great, and I really appreciate it. So we're going to wrap this one up, and then I hope we get to see everybody in the 10:45 breakout sessions, and then just everybody, the reminder that the governor's coming, and he's going to open up the last session at 1:30, so that'll be back here. So I'd like to see you all in here for that too, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.